Good afternoon, everyone. I am Michelle DiMarzo. I'm the Curator of Education and Academic Engagement here at the Fairfield University Art Museum, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to the opening lecture for our new exhibition, Andrew Forge, The Limits of Sight, which is on view exclusively for Fairfield University students, staff, and faculty this fall in our Bellarmine Hall galleries. If you're a Fairfield student who is attending this talk live for FYE credit, please make sure to snap a quick picture of the screen with the live chat and send it to museum@fairfield.edu with your student ID number. For those beyond the university community, we will be excited to share the splendor of this exhibition with you through video and photographs on our website. You can get a preview of that video by joining us tonight at 6 p.m. when we'll be celebrating the museum's 10th anniversary with a live webinar, and you can register for that on our Eventbrite page. It is now my pleasure to introduce our speaker for this afternoon. Andrew Forge, The Limits of Sight would not have been possible without Karen Wilkin, who curated the exhibition and will be sharing her reflections on Forge's work this afternoon. She is a New York-based independent curator and art critic specializing in 20th century modernism. Educated at Barnard College and Columbia University, she was awarded a Woodrow Wilson Fellowship and a Fulbright Scholarship to Rome, and has organized numerous international exhibitions. She's the author of monographs on Stuart Davis, David Smith, Anthony Caro, Kenneth Noland, Helen Frankenthaler, and Hans Hofmann. Wilkins teaches in the Master of Fine Arts program of the New York Studio School. She's also the contributing editor for Art for the Hudson Review and a regular contributor to the New Criterion, Art in America, and the Wall Street Journal. Please join me in welcoming Karen Wilkin.
Thank you, Michelle. Thank you, Michelle. It's a great pleasure to be here. I'm only sorry that we're not standing in the gallery surrounded by these wonderful paintings. We'll do the best we can with what we've got to work with these days. I'm going to start with a disclaimer. As all of you know, no reproduction ever lives up to the experience of seeing the actual work of art with its real scale, its real surface, its nuances. But Andrew Forge's paintings seem to be more resistant to reproduction than just about any I've ever seen. And that's because of the complexity of their color relationships. So what I'm going to be showing you now is what the camera sees. And that isn't quite what the human eye sees. But at least it'll give you an idea. And for those of you who will be fortunate enough to see the real thing, it'll whet your appetite. Andrew Forge is almost as elusive as his works are visually elusive. How do you categorize him? He was a painter. He was an inspiring and inspired teacher. He was a brilliant art critic and art historian. And he did that on both sides of the Atlantic, first in England and then in the United States, where he moved permanently in 1973. He may be known perhaps best to many of the audience on this side of the Atlantic for his time as the dean of the Yale University School of Art. He was also very, very involved and helped run the New York Studio School in New York, and was someone who artists who studied with him still get misty-eyed when they talk about Andrew Forge's crits in the studio. You get an inkling of that reading his wonderful writing. Last year, a collection of some of his writing came out called Observation Notation, which is happily available in paperback and has a fine selection of his writings about particular works of art, particular exhibitions, and also general observations. Those general observations can be extraordinarily trenchant. I sometimes think that Andrew Forge's uh, spectacular ability to speak about art and to talk about what he saw so trenchantly came from the fact that he was so tall, that he was higher up than anyone else. And I always think of him like some kind of great exotic bird, towering above everyone else in the room, and then bending forward from the hips like a crane to talk to us mere mortals that were down on ground level. His paintings are, I think, extraordinary. They are at once abstract about the act of putting paint on a surface and about very specific experience, all kinds. That they are specific and that they are about experience should not surprise us, even though we think of Forge as an abstract painter, because he was trained in a very old tradition of conceptual realism at the Camberwell School in London. And his teachers were people like William Coldstream, who were legendary as perceptual realists. And in fact, Forge's first works, the ones that won him attention originally, were based on perception. They're very broadly painted. He often said that Rembrandt was his favorite painter as a young artist. And he was getting a good deal of acclaim for these broadly painted paintings, often of nudes. But he became very dissatisfied with them. His first trip to the United States in 1963 introduced him to what he described later as a world of possibilities. He said he met a lot of very different artists who had nothing to do with the way he worked. In fact, I was very surprised when I was looking over his itinerary to discover that he had met Robert Rauschenberg and Jasper Johns and the choreographer Merce Cunningham and the composer John Cage. Well, that was a very particular group who reinforced each other. The last thing you'd expect someone who was interested in perceptual realism to be involved with. And it was because of this kind of freedom and openness that he went back to England and found that he could no longer make the kind of paintings that he had been making. He changed his way of working completely. And I'm going to read you the way he described it because there's just no way you could say it any better. He said that he picked up the largest canvas that he had and he made the smallest dot that he could on it with the smallest brush he had. And he did this without any forethought. It was a fantastic moment, he said, because two things happened. That point looked back at me like an eye, but also it and the canvas were talking to each other. I felt it was the most real thing I had ever done. And this is a way he was working after that heady experience of taking the smallest brush and making one mark on a large canvas. This is the last painting that Forge made before leaving England permanently to teach in the United States. And it embodies, in a sense, everything that was going to come. There are the dots of color over the surface, and there is this faint suggestion that maybe this refers to a landscape. But the more you look at it, the more that reference seems to disappear, and the more you become involved in the actual paint itself. Kent, by the way, refers to Kent in England, not in Connecticut. Next, please. That mood of abstractness and a kind of remembered image, almost a dreamlike suggestion of something that you can't quite put your finger on, becomes a hallmark of Forge's work, even though it evolves over many, many years. And this painting, which is called Fallen Tree, do you really see a fallen tree? Well, you see something that might be a tree, and then as you look at it, it dissolves into this haze of color. If you have the opportunity to go see the actual exhibition, you'll see that you get up close, they look to be all about touches of paint. As you back away, you think you're seeing an image, but then you may turn away and come back and you'll never see it again. Um, the closest analogy I can come up to is the way things disappear at night or in very low light if you stare at them. But if you look a little above them or a little away from them, you sort of see them. It's that kind of elusive vision. And that's what I mean by the limits of sight in the title, because they seem to test the limits of sight. What are we seeing? How much are we seeing? And rather than worrying about what the illusion might be, I think you must give yourself over entirely to whatever the mood, the feeling tone, the evocation of a time or a place or a season that these works conjure up. Next, please. The series I want to concentrate on today, rather than taking you on a virtual tour of the show, which be able to do on the website. And I understand there's a film that will be shown later today and then later on. I want to concentrate on a series of works that I think are quintessential Forge. They're known roughly as the months. They were not done in chronological order. They were done over many years. And the one thing they have in common is almost all of them are large 50-inch by 80-inch horizontal paintings, although there's one spectacular one in the show called August, which is nearly square, big vibrating yellow painting. And there's a late one that is a slightly different size. But by and large, it was the biggest canvas he had and the smallest brush he had all over again. They're not illustrations. They're not in any way like pointillism. These dots are not describing anything the way the dots do in Signac or in most Seurat paintings. These are dots as the record of the artist's hand moving over the surface and gradually building up these fields of color. Forge again describes the process in a very clear and helpful way. He says each painting starts with a single dot and it grows as dots accrue over the field of the canvas. During the early stages, the formative principle is simply the vibration of the dots, whether in ordered constellations or randomly dispersed. As the white field of the canvas is covered dot by dot, color reveals itself. The light of the canvas must be rediscovered and reconstructed out of the interaction of the dots. Slowly, ways of reading the painting come up. Areas press forward or drop back. There are alternatives of substance and transparency. Well, that describes the physical process very well, I think. What it doesn't tell you is the uncanny effect these paintings have of suggesting moods, seasons, weather, time. And that, in fact, is what they're about. Forge does, I don't think, sits down and says, I am now going to make a picture of June. I believe that, and there's one in the show called Monreale. It's not about the cathedral in Palermo. It is probably about his entire experience of Palermo and Sicily. Somehow the growth of the spread of the colors was either at first inspired by those ideas, but then responded to as they emerged on the canvas and developed. This painting is actually a lot greener than the camera seems to see it. And you can argue that, yes, well, June, burgeoning leaves, yes, of course, but it's not a picture of a tree. It's about Forge's experience of living in the country in Washington, Connecticut, and seeing nature change around him. Next, please. April, as I said, they're not done in chronological order. Whatever associations Forge had with this particular palette of colors, this one's a little more accurate. Um, are those vertical divisions trees? Are those vertical divisions an acknowledgement of the geometry of the canvas? Probably both. But I can't say often enough that these are not representations, they are evocations. And we're all going to bring different baggage to them, just as Forge loaded it with different baggage. You can see from this slide, I think, something of what he was talking about, about how the white of the canvas gets silted up with the dots, and how he then pulls, he's using the yellow to pull that sense of light up using color rather than the white of the canvas. Next, please. May. Is this what we think of in May? Well, it's what Forge felt like calling this painting. He had particular associations. There were things happening around him that turned into this painting. Now, you may have noticed that these have a lot of time represented by the dates. And one of the things that Forge was very conscious of is the element of the passage of time, not only in making these work, but in looking at these works. They are so demanding of your attention. As he said, they take a long time to make, and I hope they will take a long time for people to look at. The paintings change radically in terms of how far away you are from them or how close to them, and how much time you spend looking at them. It's as though we needed a more acute kind of vision than most of us has. We have to wait and let these myriad touches of color, these endlessly varied touches of color, operate. I think you even get a little bit in reproduction, where the longer you look at one of these images, you start seeing different blues. Different things start to come, seem to be in front or in back, that lively, lively pulsation. In front of the actual thing, this is endlessly fascinating. A painting that you may have thought was the kind of all over gray blue turns out to have greens and reds and yellows flickering up from underneath, as though you were staring into the water and you were seeing reflections and things that you hadn't noticed before. It's very, very time consuming painting to make because these are very, very small touches, and the orchestration of color is really complex. It would be impossible to name the colors that go into these, that make up these vibrating fields. May I have the next, please? October. Well, maybe we're seeing something we can latch onto. Is that geometric thing something to do with the man-made? Because there are paintings of man-made structures. Are these trees? We don't know. And it really doesn't matter. It's, again, as I say, it's the mood, it's the feeling. It's whatever was talking back to Forge as he accumulated these many, many touches. Next, please. This is the one vertical among them and slightly smaller. This is a fairly accurate color slide as well. that sense of the blue and the yellow and the ochre sort of changing places constantly. What's in front of what? What's suggesting distance? What is hovering in front? That's very characteristic of these works and part of their magic. The sense that you never see the same thing twice. You look away, you come back, and oh, is that the same picture I was looking at before? Um, very, very light sensitive. One of the things that is very good about the Bellarmine Gallery is that you can get that play of intimacy and distance. Those of you who do visit will see you can get right up to them in this quite intimate space of the gallery, but you also have long views, and that is something that Forge wanted. That's how he wanted his work to be seen. May I have the next? Not all of the paintings, of course, are specifically about a month or a place, um, but they are just as evocative. This is a 1995 painting, which does not give us any clue as to some of them, the month titles or Fallen Tree or Monreale. They tell us something, give us a handle. Um, but here is something which is about the experience of redness, if you like, and a relatively small painting, but one that can be read with, has great impact across the distance of the room. This one is in the show also. Next, please. Are we reading this as a landscape? Well, if we choose, we may. But it's clearly as much about the act of painting and about the way colors interpenetrate as it is about anything in the natural world. It is obviously Forge's experience of the natural world that is informing these, just as everything else is informing him. It's worth remembering, looking at a painting like this, that Forge wrote brilliantly about Monet. So the whole history of divided color, the whole legacy of Impressionist responses to nature and broken color, is something that's completely internalized and that he fully understands. He's not trying to make an imitation Monet. This is totally a Forge, but he's updating that tradition. He's moving that tradition of the 1870s and 80s into the 1990s, or at least that's one way you can think about this painting. Next, please. And some of them are really surprising. This is a summer solstice. Why? What do we know about the summer solstice? Well, all we have to do is enjoy this brilliant contrast of color. What's very, very obvious in this painting, and it's there in many of the others, but not obvious, are these little straight lines, like little staccato floating elements, which Forge called sticks. And they were the contrast, the seasoning, if you like, to the all over web of the little touches that he called drumming, those repetitive marks. And you see those yellow marks in this that seem to detach from the ground and hover with the floating blue. And you get many of the late works are very, very active in this way, even more so than some of the earlier ones. Next, please. But he could also make these extraordinarily calm, contemplative paintings. This is in the show, and then there's a larger one also within this very, very cool, rich palette of grays and off-whites and creams. And you don't, you need an Inuit vocabulary with how many hundreds of words for snow are they supposed to have. That's what you need for this painting and for the other one, which is called fog. But fortunately, you don't have to name these things. You can just take them in and enjoy them. What isn't quite coming out in this, although if you look at it, you get a better idea, is that blushing through these grays are sort of pale roses that then subside. And you don't need the title to tell you that this is a very cool painting, that this is a very contemplative painting. And if you think back to the one that was called Red Figure, you can see just how much emotion and how much sense of the particular Forge was able to load into a canvas simply by virtue of the way he orchestrated color. And orchestrated is the key word. I mean, these are working very much the way music works. No words, no libretto, no story, but appealing very, very directly through the eye to the emotions and the intellect. May I have the next, please? But he could also make very, very dramatic paintings. This is somewhat related to the uh, previous one we just looked at, Summer Solstice. They're made more or less at the same time. They may have been started at the same time, but one was gone on much more than the other. And I think you can see in these uh, relatively small works what I meant by how the later work, in saying that the later works tend to be even more active and stronger divisions, stronger contrasts between light and dark, warm and cool. This is in the exhibition also. It's very odd for me to see these with a homogeneous surface on the screen. And you have to imagine the hand that with that little brush depositing each of those bits of paint. So they remain to some extent unique. You're very aware of the way these paintings were made, particularly when you're up close. You really can imagine how cumulative, how slow, and I have some pictures at the end that I think bring that home. But they slow us down too. We get entangled in all of these touches and all of these colors, and they force you to stand in front of them and try to figure out what you're seeing, um, which, as I say, is so unstable and so rich. I had a very close friend who died a few years ago who was a concert pianist who specialized in contemporary music. She was the daughter of the composer Stefan Volpe. Caterina Volpe was her name. And she would give wonderful lectures when she played concerts of very difficult contemporary music. Now, I remember one that she gave about her father's piano music, which she dissected. And the number of voices and themes and motifs that were layered into this music. She used to say that it's a good thing her father was dead when she was performing this work, because if he wasn't, she would have killed him because it was so difficult. But she maintained that even though you could not hear all of these individual voices when the piece was played, when she hadn't dissected them all out for her lecture, that somehow we were aware of them if the piece was played properly. And I think something similar happens in Forge's paintings, where, of course, we can't take in the configuration of each field of color layered in with all the others. We can't do that. He may have a memory of that, the way he described the way the colors get built up on the white of the canvas. But those vibrations are in there. We get them. We get the harmonies, the cumulative effect. May I have the next, please? These are late paintings. They're one of these is in the show, Heavy Hemlocks 1. And does it look anything like a hemlock? Do you have any, can you identify any part of this that you say, oh, well, that's the tree and that's the background? Certainly not. But somehow the combination of these uh, forms, weighty forms that dissolve as you look, of the yellow and gold, uh, against this darker field, which is quite a bit greener than it appears in the photograph. Um, there's something about that that is very suggestive of one's experience of large evergreen trees. And again, you can see this staccato counterpoint of the drumming, the sticks against the drumming, creating this very, very active field. This is the next one, please. This is the second heavy hemlocks. Forge often would revisit a configuration and what happens if I do this? What happens if I do that? Um, trying new visual effects. May I have the next? We have, thank you. We have a large group of Forge's works on paper in the exhibition, which reproduce much better than the paintings. That's partly scale, but that's also because the works on paper are almost like watching Forge think. And when I was putting this talk together, I debated, should I put the works on paper first? And then I thought, well, maybe not. But as you can see, he's exploring different possibilities on paper. They're quite small. These are about, I think, maybe, well, the biggest ones are about 18 inches tall. Most of them are smaller. And you can see how he's trying out different combinations of touch, different degrees of openness or density. May I have the next two, please? The most striking thing about the works on paper is their difference. No two are alike. Now, some of these things may have been excavated from canvases. It may have been a painting had looked sort of like this at a certain point in its history, and he decided, well, let me capture that. Let me see. These aren't preparations for paintings, though. I think they represent possibility, and they give us an insight into Forge's mind. And the combination of the very fortunate that we have both the works on paper and the canvases. There isn't a one-on-one relationship among any of them, but there is this larger uh, discovery of possibilities and alternatives that I think helps us see the canvases better. May I have the next, please? You can see how dense they can become or how sparse. And you can imagine that in all of the paintings, even though the entire surface is filled, that maybe there's something like this in there. You have a little bit of a key also in a painting that is one of Forge's last paintings, which is called December, which is hanging in the same space as the first painting I showed you, the one called Winter Kent, which was the last painting he made in England. And we also have one of the last paintings he made in America. It may not be quite finished, so that also gives us an insight into the evolution of the paintings. May I have the next, please? And that's how they were made. When I talked about Andrew bending over from the hips to reach us mere mortals, he bent from the hips to reach his paintings as well. And that sense of concentration and the funneling into this all over surface is what it took to create these magical webs. As I say, I hope that this has whetted your appetite. Someday we'll be able to see more live forges. The Yale Center for British Art, the Yale University Art Museum has a very good collection. Yale University and the Art Museum and the Yale Center for British Art have been very, very generous in lending to this exhibition. So the students and the faculty and any special visitors will have a wonderful opportunity to see those as well. Um, I was delighted to work on the show. I hope more people will be able to see it as time goes on. Thank you. I have, I think I have a bit more time. If anyone has questions or comments, I'd be very happy to hear them.
Yes, I do think we have a couple of questions in the chat. So first of all, thank you so much, Karen. That was an incredibly, as one of the people who have been privileged to see the work up close in person, that was incredibly stimulating to listen to. Our first
Thank you.
question for you is coming from Kyle, who would like to know, is that raw canvas that's left behind, or is the painting surface completely covered?
I believe it's completely covered. The paint really sits up, and if it were raw, those touches would sink in more. He's also an oil painter, so that the likelihood of working in oil on raw canvas in this way is very unlikely. So I'm quite sure these are primed in some way.
And our next question comes from Fairfield's own John Mendelsohn, who is a studio art professor. He says he is viewing with students from his color workshop, his Fairfield University course. And he comments that Forge is a poetic colorist. How do you relate his particular way with color to other modernist painters? And did Forge express any philosophical or other beliefs that might have informed his work?
Those are hard questions. I think he, as I said, you can see him as a kind of modernist impressionist. And I don't mean that in a denigrating way. It's as though, having spent much time thinking and writing about Monet, he felt there are important ideas here that have not yet been exhausted in the relationship to perceptions of nature. The artists that he was friendliest with, though, tended not to be abstract color painters. William Bailey, wonderful painter and draftsman of still lives and nudes and occasional street scene, who also taught at Yale, was a close friend and someone whom Ford wrote about very eloquently. His wife, Ruth Miller, is a perceptual painter. So he was constantly thinking about issues of how you translate perception into mark making, not in a literal way. He was very, very well informed about what was going on around him, and certainly very aware of what his American coevals were doing. He's pretty much an exact contemporary of Helen Frankenthaler and of Andy Warhol. So he was born in a few years earlier. So you can make of that what you will. His closest friends tended to be, so it's, I don't think he was pitting himself against his contemporaries. I think he had a clear idea of what he wanted to do and pursued it. I don't know if that answers your question, but it's what I know.
Well, if John doesn't, maybe he'll write a follow-up. But I have a question of
Good.
my own, and that is, I wonder if, in your experience, if Forge ever commented on failure and if he ever abandoned some of his paintings.
He would, I think, he never talked about abandoning them. I have to ask Ruth Miller more about that. My impression was that, and from talking to him and from being in the studio, and from also the way he talked to students, because I know a number of artists who studied with him Kyle Stavers, one, and many others who came out of Yale. And then there were the students that he was so involved with at the studio school in his crits. And the impression that I received was that he didn't suggest abandoning something. He just keep at it, keep at it, keep at it. And certainly that was his own method. Um, I I don't know if he ever really abandoned a painting or whether he would just keep adding to it. And the dates on those paintings suggest that he would keep rethinking, adding.
Hmm.
I don't think it was simply that it took such a long time to get all those dots on there. It was also rethinking as the dots went on.
And we have a question from Carmen, who asks whether you think that Forge has been a little forgotten. She comments that she lives in England and she hadn't heard of him until recently. And if so, why do you think that's the case?
Well, he left England in '73 and he never went back. Um, the last big show was at the Yale Center for British Art, and that was in the early 2000s. I can't tell you how beautiful those paintings looked in that Lucan building. It was the perfect setting for them. He was never, he's always been a painter's painter. He's never been the sort of person who was going to be on the cover of Art in America anytime soon. Partly, I think, because he was so revered as both a teacher and a writer. That's in for his generation, the notion of being now nobody's a teacher, everyone's an educator and a critic and an artist and well, that kind of multiplicity was unusual for someone of his generation. So I think he tended to be pigeonholed as a professor of art. But fortunately, he's represented by has been represented by very good dealers, by Robert Miller and Betty Cunningham, and uh, he is shown with some regularity in the commercial world. The big problem is that there's a finite number of works. He was not enormously productive. And has he been forgotten? I don't think he's been so forgotten as he's always been well known to the people who have been aware of him, and less so to the larger art world, in a way, because the work is so personal and so out of sync with many of, you think about the dates of these paintings. They have nothing to do with conceptual art. They have nothing to do with political art. They have nothing to do with much of what was getting most of the attention at the time that they were made.
I think we have time for one more question, and it is, in fact, a follow-up from John Mendelsohn, who thanks you for your earlier response and asks if Forge wrote specifically about his feelings about color in his paintings.
It's woven in with writings. It's sort of, it's, at best I can recall, it's he's writing about perception. He's writing about his awareness of what he's seeing, and color is part of that. As I say, the collection is very good and gives a observation notation, and readily available on Amazon at a very attractive price. I didn't write it, so it's by David Cast edited it, so I can give it a plug with a clear conscience.
Great. Well, I just want to thank you again, Karen, for this wonderful talk. Thank you to everyone who has been listening. And for those of you who are in the Fairfield University community, Andrew Forge, The Limits of Sight, will be on view in the Bellarmine Hall galleries. We are open Monday through Friday from 10 a.m. to 4 p.m. For those of you outside the community, we hope you will check our website and see some of the wonderful ways we have to engage with Andrew Forge's work. Thank you again. Have a great afternoon.